The jeeps rolled to a stop in the castle courtyard, and Lieutenant Shapiro's blood went cold. SS troops, dozens of them, armed, moving between the stables and stone archways like they owned the place. The small American task force, 24 men, 11 vehicles, had just driven 52 miles behind what were technically still enemy lines to retrieve the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. And now they were staring at an SS cavalry division headquarters. General Stack's hand moved closer to his sidearm. The question hung in the alpine air: would they leave this castle with Hermann Göring, or would they become hostages themselves? 3 hours south, Göring sat trapped in traffic. Refugees clogged every road. The Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, founder of the Gestapo, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor, reduced to sitting in a bus, waiting for peasants and discharged soldiers to clear the highway. His wife adjusted her coat. His daughter stared out the window. Everything he'd spent 12 years building had collapsed in 12 weeks. But Göring had a plan. He always had a plan. Rewind to April 23rd, 2 weeks earlier. The situation demanded clarity. Hitler was in his bunker. Berlin was encircled. The Red Army was blocks away from the Chancellery. And Göring, banished to Bavaria after falling from grace, sat in his Obersalzberg villa, holding a piece of paper that would either save Germany or destroy him. The paper was Hitler's decree from 1941, clear language, direct succession. In the event that I am impeded in the discharge of my duties by sickness or other circumstances, even temporarily, I denote as my deputy in all my offices the Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, Hermann Göring. General Koller had flown from Berlin with alarming news. Hitler had collapsed, suffered a breakdown, told his generals the war was lost, said he would stay in the bunker and die. Then, according to Colonel General Jodl, Hitler mentioned Göring should negotiate with the Allies because he'd be better at it. Göring called for Dr. Lammers, the senior civil servant. Together they reviewed the succession protocols. The logic seemed airtight. Hitler was trapped underground, the Soviet noose tightening, technically impeded. Göring's moment had arrived, the chance to restore his tarnished reputation by negotiating an end to the bloodshed. Lammers looked uncomfortable. The Führer was still breathing. Göring composed a radiogram. Every word mattered. Too passive, and he'd miss his window. Too aggressive, and Hitler might view it as mutiny. He crafted careful phrasing. If I do not receive an answer by 10 p.m., I shall consider the conditions of your decree as satisfied and act for the good of nation and fatherland. He also radioed Field Marshal Keitel and Foreign Minister Ribbentrop with similar instructions. If Hitler couldn't give orders by 10 p.m., a functioning government needed to exist. The Reich couldn't be allowed to fracture. The radiogram went out at 3 p.m. on April 23rd. Inside the bunker, 600 kilometers away, Martin Bormann intercepted every message. Hitler's loyal party secretary, Göring's bitter enemy, saw his opportunity. He brought the radiograms to Hitler with a simple interpretation: treason, an attempted coup. Göring trying to replace the Führer while he still lived. Hitler's rage was volcanic. Arrest him immediately. Bormann moved with lethal efficiency. He radioed Grand Admiral Dönitz in the north. Prevent all flights, block airfields, move like lightning. Then he contacted SS Colonel Frank at the Obersalzberg garrison. Frank assembled 85 SS troops and surrounded Göring's villa within hours. At 8 p.m., Göring's phone line went dead. At 10 p.m., Frank entered with a squad of armed men. Reich Marshal, you are under arrest. Göring's face drained of color. One miscalculated telegram had undone him. Bormann sent another message: resign from all positions for health reasons or face execution. Göring signed immediately. Survival first. He was still a Reich Marshal, still had value. This could be reversed once cooler heads prevailed. 24 hours passed. Then the sirens started wailing. April 25th. 359 RAF Lancaster bombers appeared over the Obersalzberg, guided by Mosquito Pathfinders, the same bomber force that had recently obliterated Kiel. Göring tried running for the tunnels beneath his villa, but SS guards forced him back at gunpoint. When the second wave approached, they finally herded him, his family, and his staff into the freezing underground passages. The house above them disintegrated. For days they remained underground, cold, hungry, uncertain. Then another message arrived from Bormann's bunker, this one directed at Colonel Frank: kill Göring if Berlin falls. But on April 26th, a new SS officer appeared, Ernst Brosler, from Himmler's legal staff. The next day, a fresh SS unit took control. Himmler had outmaneuvered Bormann, extracting Göring from execution range. A living Reich Marshal might prove useful. After all, Himmler was conducting his own secret negotiations with the West through Sweden. Brosler asked Göring where he wanted to be held. Maudendorf Castle in Austria, Göring suggested. He'd spent childhood summers there. The medieval fortress sat 40 miles south, remote and defensible. Early morning, April 28th. Göring climbed into his armored Mercedes with his wife Emmy and daughter Etta. An SS platoon and trucks formed the escort. The convoy wound through mountain roads to Maudendorf. Within hours, Göring had recreated his accustomed lifestyle. Wine, cigars, comfortable furniture arranged to his specifications. Colonel Brosler proved surprisingly pleasant company, sharing drinks in the castle's wood-paneled rooms. The SS officer visited General Koller a day later and remarked, "You know, Göring's a splendid fellow. I won't do him any harm." The Reich Marshal appeared to have landed softly. April 30th. Brosler entered carrying a decoded message from Berlin. He handed it to Göring without expression. "Shoot the traitors of April 23rd if we should die." Göring's hand trembled. This was the first time he'd seen Bormann's original kill order in full. The party secretary had genuinely intended his execution. May first brought different news. Hitler was dead. Suicide in the bunker, though the official announcement claimed he'd fallen defending Berlin. The Führer's death changed every calculation. With Hitler gone, the disgrace meant nothing. The treason charges evaporated. Göring was once again Germany's senior military figure, and more importantly, he had connections and recognition in the West. Brosler telephoned Field Marshal Kesselring, commander of southern Germany's remaining forces. Should he execute Göring per Hitler's standing order? Kesselring said no, but added that the Reich Marshal shouldn't be released either. Göring saw the opportunity clearly. Grand Admiral Dönitz had become the new Reich president in the north, but Dönitz lacked political sophistication. Göring, on the other hand, had negotiated international treaties, hosted diplomats, understood how Americans thought. If anyone could arrange terms with General Eisenhower, it was Hermann Göring. May 4th. Göring dispatched his personal physician to General Koller with a formal request: arrange a meeting with Supreme Commander Eisenhower. Koller forwarded it to Kesselring. Kesselring radioed Dönitz. No response came. Dönitz was dealing with his own crisis. Himmler's secret negotiations had been exposed before Hitler's death, and now the disgraced SS leader was also claiming he should negotiate with the West. The official story claims a passing Luftwaffe unit discovered Göring at Maudendorf on May 4th and liberated him from SS custody. The reality was simpler. With Hitler dead and surrender days away, Brosler and his men saw no reason to guard a prisoner who no longer mattered to the collapsing regime. On May 6th, Kesselring ordered Brosler to stand down. The SS withdrew. Göring immediately summoned Koller. "I, as Germany's most senior general, must be sent to meet Eisenhower. I am the most popular of our generals, particularly in the United States." He also radioed Dönitz directly, offering to handle Allied negotiations. Speed was critical. The Soviets were advancing into Austria from the east. If they reached him first, he'd face Stalin's justice, which meant no justice at all. He needed American custody, and he needed it now. Göring ordered Colonel von Brauchitsch, his military aide, to drive his armored Mercedes through the chaos and reach American lines. Von Brauchitsch carried 2 letters, one addressed to Marshal Eisenhower, another to General Devers, U.S. Army commander. Both proposed a meeting at Fishhorn Castle to discuss terms. May 6th, late afternoon. The reconnaissance platoon of the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, U.S. 36th Infantry Division, was 6 miles south of Bad Tölz when their radio crackled. German Army Group G has surrendered. Effective 1200 hours, May 6th. All units hold position. Do not fire unless fired upon. The war in their sector had essentially ended. They drove into Kufstein, just across the Austrian border, with headlights blazing. That's where von Brauchitsch found them. When Division Command realized Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, Luftwaffe chief, one of the most recognizable faces of the Nazi regime, was offering himself up, they formulated a plan immediately. Assistant Division Commander Brigadier General Robert Stack would drive behind German lines to Fishhorn Castle and retrieve the prisoner before the Soviets got there or Göring changed his mind. The mission launched the morning of May 7th. Stack climbed into his Plymouth staff car. Von Brauchitsch's Mercedes would lead. The escort was improvised from available units. First Lieutenant Sill with 5 jeeps and 2 M8 armored cars from the 636th Tank Destroyers. Second Lieutenant Shapiro with half a dozen intelligence troops and 2 more jeeps from the 142nd Infantry. 11 vehicles total, 24 men. The war wasn't technically over. German units were still armed, still organized, still capable of fighting if they chose to. 52 miles separated Kufstein from Fishhorn Castle. 52 miles through uncertain territory. The convoy rolled out, following von Brauchitsch through alpine valleys and narrow passes. They drove past German soldiers parking vehicles, manning artillery pieces, sitting in fields. Self-propelled guns lined the roadsides. Some Germans saluted as the Americans passed. The M8 crews rotated their turrets to the rear and elevated their guns, a signal they weren't looking for a fight. At each intersection stood a German soldier with a rifle. General Koller had sent men ahead to mark the route. The Americans followed the human signposts higher into the mountains, climbing the Thurn Pass at over 4,000 feet. The M8 armored cars fell behind, unable to keep pace with the lighter vehicles on the steep grades. Fishhorn Castle came into view, medieval stone perched above the valley. Stack's Plymouth led the convoy through the gate into the courtyard. That's when they saw the SS. 60 SS troopers, armed, moving with purpose through the cobblestone courtyard. Rifles slung, machine pistols visible. The castle wasn't just a meeting point, it was headquarters for the Florian Geyer Cavalry Division, an SS unit still fully operational. The division's chief of staff stood in the doorway, SS Colonel Waldemar Fegelein. His brother Hermann had been Himmler's liaison at Hitler's bunker, married to Eva Braun's sister. Hermann had been caught trying to desert Berlin and executed on Hitler's orders just days earlier for his connection to Himmler's treason. Waldemar had survived, and now he watched 24 Americans roll into his courtyard. Lieutenant Shapiro kept his hand near his sidearm. The SS troops largely ignored the small American force, continuing their routines in the stables and outbuildings. They didn't enter the castle itself, but their presence saturated every corner of the compound. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and Stack's retrieval mission could become a hostage situation. General Stack entered the castle. Göring wasn't there. The Reich Marshal was still at Maudendorf, 70 kilometers south. When General Kuller's phone call reached him, "You asked for the rendezvous, now keep it." Göring gathered his entourage with visible irritation. His wife, Emmy, daughter Etta, his 2 sisters. Emmy's 2 sisters and 2 nieces. Also joining, SS General Philipp Bauer, chief of the Chancellery of the Führer, traveling with his wife. General Franz Ritter von Epp with his aides, drivers, servants, secretaries. 30 people, total, packed into a limousine and a Luftwaffe bus. They headed west toward Fishhorn. The roads were impassable. Refugees choked every highway. Discharged soldiers wandered aimlessly, no longer part of any unit. Farm carts. Families on foot carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. The Soviet advance from the east had triggered a massive westward exodus. Everyone wanted to reach American or British lines before the Red Army arrived. Göring's vehicles crawled through the human river at walking speed. At Fishhorn, Stack made a tactical decision. Remaining with the castle full of SS was untenable, but abandoning the mission wasn't an option. An agreement was reached with Colonel Fegelein. Joint sentry posts, 1 GI, 1 SS trooper, both armed. A fragile arrangement, but it held. Word reached the castle that Göring's party was stalled near Radstedt, stuck in traffic. Stack stayed at Fishhorn to maintain the delicate truce with Fegelein's SS troops. He sent 2nd Lieutenant Shapiro forward in the Plymouth with 2 jeeps to locate the Reich Marshal and extract him from the refugee chaos. Shapiro's small detachment pushed through the clogged roads. His orders were clear. Find Göring, get him in the car, bring him to Fishhorn before something goes wrong. They found the vehicles stopped beside the road. The Luftwaffe bus, the limousine. Refugees had recognized the Reich Marshal. Even in his simplified late-war uniform, Göring's face was unmistakable to every German. Word was spreading through the crowd. Shapiro approached. His German was functional, enough for basic communication. Göring stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his cap. The man who'd commanded the Luftwaffe, built the Gestapo, looted half of Europe's art treasures, stood on a muddy roadside, surrounded by the wreckage of the regime he'd helped create. His first words to his American captor carried no defiance, no ideology, no loyalty to the fallen Führer. 12 years, I've had a good run for my money. Shapiro blinked. That was it? No dramatics? No final Nazi salute? Just an acknowledgement that the party was over and he'd enjoyed the ride while it lasted? Göring climbed into the Plymouth. His family and staff loaded into their vehicles under American supervision. The convoy turned back toward Fishhorn, Shapiro's jeeps providing escort. It was 11:30 p.m. on May 7th when the vehicles rolled through the castle gates. Göring saw the SS troops and went rigid. His confidence evaporated. These weren't ceremonial guards. These were Florian Geyer division men, hardened from brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. And Göring had no protection. He met General Stack in the courtyard. The American brigadier general assessed his prize. Göring looked older than his photographs, heavier, tired, but his mind was clearly active, already calculating his next moves. "When do I get to meet Eisenhower?" Göring asked through Lieutenant Shapiro's translation. Stack deflected. The question persisted. Göring continued, his tone hopeful, almost eager. "Should I wear a pistol or my ceremonial dagger when I appear before Eisenhower?" Stack's reply was blunt. "I don't care 2 hoots." The Americans escorted Göring to quarters inside the castle. He bathed, changed, and emerged in his powder blue Reich Marshal uniform, the elaborate one he'd kept despite the war's deterioration. He posed for photographs in front of a Texas flag. The 36th Infantry Division hailed from the Lone Star State, and someone had thought it would make a memorable image. Before retiring, Göring made one more request. The SS outside made him nervous. Could he retain 4 MP-40 machine pistols for personal protection? Stack agreed. 4 of Göring's adjutants armed themselves and stood guard outside his room through the night. Before closing the door, Göring spoke to his wife. "I've formed a good impression of Stack. Perhaps I can still do something to help Germany." He genuinely believed negotiation remained possible, that his connections, his reputation in America before the war, his knowledge of diplomacy would make him valuable. Eisenhower would want to speak with him. Terms could be discussed. Germany could avoid complete destruction. The Americans had different plans. May 8th. Göring dressed in his plain Luftwaffe uniform and forage cap, decorations removed for travel. He was separated from Emmy and Etta. No explanation given, just orders. Colonel von Brauchitsch accompanied him into General Stack's car for a drive north to Kitzbühel, where the 36th Division had established new headquarters. At this stage, Göring still carried his sidearm, an American-made Smith & Wesson revolver. He'd owned it for years, a status symbol from his pre-war visits to the United States. No one had asked him to surrender it yet. The Grand Hotel in Kitzbühel had been converted into the 36th Division's command post. Major General Dahlquist waited inside. Göring entered, still expecting protocol, still believing his rank carried weight. Dahlquist saluted. The gesture seemed to confirm Göring's assumptions. The general invited the Reich Marshal to lunch, chicken, potatoes, and peas served in mess tins. Nothing fancy, but the atmosphere remained cordial. After the meal, they moved to a fireside room. Coffee appeared. The conversation flowed. Göring relaxed into the role he'd imagined for himself, the reasonable Nazi, the man who could bridge the gap between Germany and the West. He spoke freely. Hitler had been narrow-minded and ignorant, he said. Ribbentrop was a scoundrel. Hess, the former deputy Führer who'd flown to Scotland in 1941, was simply eccentric. Dahlquist listened. Stack nodded. Göring interpreted their attention as a validation. He'd made the right choice, reaching out to the Americans. This would work. But higher command in Eisenhower's headquarters saw the photographs, read the reports. The red carpet treatment for Hitler's second-in-command did not sit well. Orders came down immediately. Göring is a war criminal, not a negotiating partner. Treat him accordingly. May 9th. The Americans informed Göring he'd be flown to 7th Army headquarters in Augsburg for debriefing. A small airstrip outside Kitzbühel served as the departure point. The pilot, Captain Beaufoster, arrived and assessed his passenger. Göring weighed over 260 pounds. Foster's assigned aircraft was a Piper L-4 spotter plane, a tiny two-seater designed for reconnaissance. Foster shook his head. The math didn't work. That much weight would never get airborne in an L-4, especially at this altitude. A frantic search produced a Piper L-5, slightly larger, slightly more powerful. Foster had minimal experience flying the L-5, but it would have to do. Just the two of them. 55 minutes in the air. No guards, no translators, no witnesses. Foster spoke broken German. Göring's English was limited but functional. They communicated in fragments, gestures, basic phrases. Foster later told his wife the Reich Marshal gave him the creeps, effeminate mannerisms, an unsettling pleasantness, as if they were traveling companions rather than captor and prisoner. The flight felt surreal, soaring over devastated Germany with one of the men responsible for its destruction sitting inches away. They landed at Augsburg. The ground crew rolled a jeep to the aircraft. Foster, seizing a moment of personal history, asked Göring to sign a blank flight report. The Reich Marshal obliged, writing in careful script, "Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall." A souvenir from the apocalypse. Göring was loaded into the jeep and driven to 7th Army headquarters. Colonel von Brauchitsch had arrived separately by road and waited inside. An American officer escorted Göring into a small plane room. The door closed. The order was direct. Surrender your firearm. Remove all medals and decorations. Leave only your Reich Marshal epaulets. Göring's expression shifted. The Smith & Wesson revolver came off his belt. Then the medals. The Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, created specifically for him by Hitler. The pilot's badge in gold with diamonds. The Pour le Mérite from the First World War, Germany's highest military honor. Each decoration represented rank, achievement, power. Piece by piece, they were stripped away. He hadn't expected this. The lunches, the salutes, the fireside conversations. He'd believed those gestures meant something. Now he stood in a bare room, disarmed and diminished, while American officers catalogued his possessions like evidence. May 11th. The press conference. Göring was dressed again in his pale blue uniform, still stripped of decorations, except for the epaulets. 50 Allied newspaper reporters packed the room. Cameras flashed. Questions flew in English, translated into German, answered and translated back. The session wasn't a negotiation. It was a spectacle. Göring displayed for the media like a captured prize. The questions weren't about peace terms or Germany's future. They were about his guilt, Hitler's madness, the concentration camps, the looted art. Orders arrived that afternoon. Göring was to be classified officially as a war criminal. No diplomatic courtesies, no further informal meetings. He would be transferred to a special detention facility to prepare for trial, Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a code name for the detention center where high-value Nazi prisoners were interrogated and processed. The Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains had been converted into a secure compound. Göring arrived and found himself among familiar faces, generals, ministers, officials, the surviving leadership of the Reich, all waiting for their turn before the tribunal. The illusion had fully shattered. There would be no meeting with Eisenhower, no negotiated settlement, no role as the reasonable intermediary who could salvage something from the wreckage. Göring was a defendant, not a diplomat. Months passed. Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal convened in the bombed city where the Nazi Party had once held massive rallies. 24 defendants faced charges of conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Göring sat in the first seat of the defendant's dock, still the highest-ranking survivor, even in defeat. The trial lasted nearly a year. Evidence mounted, testimonies accumulated, documents surfaced detailing decisions, orders, policies. Göring defended himself aggressively, often dominating the courtroom with his intelligence and verbal skill. But the verdict was never in doubt. October 1st, 1946. Guilty on all counts. Sentence. Death by hanging. Göring requested a firing squad, arguing his military rank entitled him to a soldier's death. The request was denied. Hanging had been specified deliberately, a civilian's execution, removing any residual military honor. October 15th. The night before his scheduled execution, Göring ingested a cyanide capsule, smuggled into his cell somehow, hidden for months, saved for this final act of control. Hermann Göring chose the manner of his death, denying the Allies their ultimate tribunal judgment. His body was photographed in the cell as proof, then cremated. The ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. The looted art presented its own epilogue. The trains Göring had shipped from Karrenhall to Bavaria were discovered by French and American troops in tunnels and rail sidings near Berchtesgaden. Locals had already broken into some cars, stealing what they could carry. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, silver, scattered across the Bavarian countryside. The U.S. Army recovered much of it and staged a public exhibition in Berchtesgaden, but pieces remain missing to this day, lost in the chaos of the Reich's collapse. The mission to capture Göring had taken 3 days from first contact to press conference, but the real story had been building since April 20th, when Göring left Berlin for the last time after Hitler's birthday reception. 21 days of calculation, survival instinct, and miscalculation that ended with cameras flashing in an American headquarters. Göring's fall illustrated the Nazi regime's final characteristic: every leader for himself. Bormann had tried to have him killed. Himmler had tried to use him as a bargaining chip while conducting his own secret negotiations. Ribbentrop had remained silent. Dönitz had ignored his messages. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years, and in its final weeks, the architects of its horrors turned on each other with the same ruthlessness they'd shown their victims. The American task force that retrieved Göring took calculated risks, driving 52 miles through territory where German units still held weapons, still maintained chain of command, still could have resisted. The SS presence at Fishhorn represented the mission's most dangerous moment. 60 armed troops from a cavalry division could have easily overwhelmed 24 Americans. But by May 7th, even the SS understood the war was finished. Fighting would achieve nothing except more deaths in a cause already lost. Lieutenant Shapiro's extraction of Göring from the refugee-choked roads demonstrated another reality of the collapse. Millions were moving west. The eastern territories, Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, were being emptied as civilians fled the Soviet advance. The roads Göring traveled were packed with people who'd lost everything, while he sat in a limousine with his family and servants, still expecting special treatment. His first words to Shapiro, 12 years I've had a good run for my money, revealed the transactional nature of his Nazi loyalty. Not ideology, not commitment to Hitler's vision, just 12 years of wealth, power, and privilege. When that ended, Göring pivoted immediately to self-preservation. The radiogram to Eisenhower, the eagerness to negotiate, the assumption he'd be treated as a valuable diplomatic asset, all calculated moves by a man who'd spent a lifetime maneuvering for advantage. The photographs taken at Fishhorn on the night of May 7th show Göring in his powder blue uniform, posing before the Texas flag. He's smiling slightly, relaxed, clearly believing the worst is behind him. Those images were distributed to newspapers worldwide within days. The public reaction was intense. Here was Hitler's deputy, the man who'd promised no bombs would fall on German cities, the architect of the Luftwaffe's terror campaigns against Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and dozens of other cities, standing comfortably in American custody, looking like a visiting dignitary rather than a war criminal. The backlash reached Eisenhower's headquarters immediately. Supreme Command issued explicit orders: no more photo opportunities, no more cordial meals, no more treatment, suggesting Göring was anything other than a prisoner facing justice for his crimes. The drive to Kitzbühel on May 8th followed protocol, but the lunch with General Dahlquist crossed lines. Göring's commentary on other Nazi leaders, calling Hitler narrow-minded, Ribbentrop a scoundrel, Hess-eccentric, was calculated distancing. He was attempting to position himself as the reasonable Nazi, the one who'd seen through Hitler's madness, the one the Allies could work with. The strategy might have succeeded in a different context, but by May 1945, the evidence of Nazi atrocities was overwhelming. The concentration camps had been liberated. Eisenhower himself had toured Ohrdruf, seeing the corpses, the gas chambers, the crematoria. No amount of charm or political maneuvering would erase Göring's complicity. The Piper L5 flight to Augsburg marked Göring's final moments of relative freedom. 55 minutes alone with an American pilot who found him disturbing. Captain Foster's description, effeminate and gave me the creeps, captured the disconnect between Göring's public image as a military strongman and his actual personality. The vanity, the love of luxury and elaborate uniforms, the collector's obsession with art and jewels, the dependence on morphine and other medications. Göring was as much a creature of decadence as military leadership. The signed flight report Foster kept became a minor artifact of the war's end. Göring's signature, careful and precise, written in the sky over defeated Germany. Foster preserved it, eventually donating it to a museum. Thousands of such small relics survived. Signed documents, confiscated medals, personal effects, each one a fragment of the regime's collapse. Augsburg, May 9th. The small room where Göring was ordered to disarm and remove his decorations represented the definitive shift in his status. The Smith & Wesson revolver, ironic that Hitler's second-in-command carried an American weapon, was confiscated. The medals, each one representing a specific honor or achievement in Nazi Germany's hierarchy, were catalogued and placed in evidence bags. Göring's face in that moment, captured by a guard's description, showed genuine shock. He'd misread every signal, the salutes, the meals, the conversations. He'd interpreted them as respect when they were simply protocol. Now, stripped of his decorations, he stood as a prisoner, not a negotiating partner. The pale blue uniform remained, but without the medals and insignia, it looked like a costume. Göring had designed that uniform himself years earlier, choosing the color, the cut, the elaborate styling. It had been part of his carefully constructed image as the Renaissance man of the Nazi leadership, cultured, refined, powerful. Without the decorations, it just looked absurd. May 11th. 50 Allied reporters, cameras, notebooks, questions translated through interpreters. Göring attempted to maintain dignity, answering questions with the verbal skill that had made him effective in earlier years. But the questions weren't softballs. They were about concentration camps, about looted art, about terror bombing, about his personal responsibility for decisions that had killed millions. The press conference footage exists. Göring sitting at a table, American officers flanking him, reporters shouting questions. His responses were defensive, evasive, occasionally combative. When asked about the camps, he claimed ignorance. When asked about the art collections, he called them legitimate acquisitions. When asked about his loyalty to Hitler, he praised the Führer's early vision while criticizing his later mistakes. None of it mattered. The classification as war criminal ended any lingering ambiguity. Transfer orders arrived. Camp Aschken, Luxembourg. The code name masked a converted hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, now a secure compound for high-ranking Nazi prisoners. Göring arrived to find the Reich's surviving leadership gathered behind wire. Grand Admiral Dönitz, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, Economics Minister Funk, generals and ministers who'd once commanded armies and nations, now reduced to inmates awaiting trial. The Palace Hotel had been stripped of luxury, bare rooms, prison rations, constant surveillance. Göring's weight began dropping. The morphine and paracodeine he'd depended on for years were no longer available. Withdrawal hit hard. The interrogations started immediately. American and British officers, intelligence personnel, prosecutors building cases. Every decision, every order, every meeting during 12 years of Nazi rule was being documented and cross-referenced. Göring maintained his mental sharpness despite the physical decline. He answered questions strategically, admitting what was already proven, denying what couldn't be documented, deflecting blame toward Hitler when possible. The prosecutors noted his intelligence. Among the captured Nazi elite, Göring remained the most formidable, quick-thinking, verbally skilled, still dangerous in a courtroom setting. Summer turned to autumn. The International Military Tribunal structure took shape. Nuremberg was chosen deliberately, the city where massive Nazi Party rallies had been staged, where the racial laws had been proclaimed, now the site of judgment. The Palace of Justice had survived the bombing relatively intact. Renovations created a courtroom capable of holding dozens of defendants, prosecutors from 4 Allied nations, translators, press, and observers. November 20th, 1945. The trial opened. 21 defendants initially, though Martin Bormann was tried in absentia, still missing, presumed dead in Berlin's ruins. Robert Ley, the labor chief, had already committed suicide in custody. Göring sat in the first seat of the defendant's dock. Even in defeat, the hierarchy persisted. The charges were unprecedented. Conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented thousands of documents, orders signed by the defendants, minutes from meetings, correspondence, policy directives. Film footage from liberated concentration camps played on screens. Survivors testified. The evidence accumulated day after day, week after week. Göring defended himself aggressively. When his turn came to testify, he spoke for hours, framing himself as a loyal soldier following his country's leader, distinguishing between military necessity and criminal excess. His performance impressed observers with its intelligence and rhetorical skill. But skill couldn't overcome evidence. The documents bore his signature. The policies bore his implementation. The looted art had filled his houses. The Luftwaffe's terror bombing campaigns. The persecution of Jews, which Göring had initiated even before the final solution. The plunder of occupied territories, which he'd organized through systematic requisition programs. The use of slave labor in armaments production under his 4-year plan authority. Each charge came with documentation. The trial lasted 10 months, nearly 400 open sessions, thousands of documents entered as evidence, 33 witnesses for the prosecution, 61 for the defense. Göring's cross-examination of witnesses showed flashes of his former power, sharp questions, aggressive challenges, attempts to control the narrative. The judges frequently had to rein him in. September 30th, 1946. The tribunal reconvened for verdicts. Göring stood as his judgment was read. Count 1, conspiracy, guilty. Count 2, crimes against peace, guilty. Count 3, war crimes, guilty. Count 4, crimes against humanity, guilty. Sentence, death by hanging. 12 defendants received death sentences. 7 received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted, though they faced immediate rearrest by German authorities for other proceedings. Göring petitioned the tribunal for execution by firing squad. He cited his military rank, his status as a soldier rather than a common criminal. The request traveled through command channels to Allied Control Council. The answer came back, denied. The method had been specified deliberately. Hanging removed any vestige of military honor. October 15th, 1946. Execution scheduled for the following morning. The condemned were held in individual cells, guards maintaining constant watch. 2-hour shifts, orders to observe the prisoners continuously. Göring's cell was searched daily. His possessions were minimal, monitored, controlled. Yet somehow, and the full answer has never been established, he'd obtained a cyanide capsule. Theories multiplied. Hidden in his belongings when first captured. Smuggled by a sympathetic guard. Concealed in a gift package from his wife, though all such items underwent inspection. Transferred between prisoners through the exercise yard. The method mattered less than the result. At 21:49 hours on October 15th, a guard noticed Göring wasn't breathing. Medical personnel rushed in. The cyanide had worked in minutes. Hermann Göring was dead at age 53, 2 hours before his scheduled execution. The body was photographed extensively, documentation that he hadn't escaped justice even if he'd escaped the noose. The other condemned men were hanged on schedule early on October 16th. Göring's body was displayed alongside them afterward for official identification. All remains were cremated. The ashes scattered in an undisclosed river to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine. No marker, no memorial. Just obliteration as complete as the regime itself. The looted art collections presented their own postscript. American and French troops discovered Göring's trains and railway tunnels near Berchtesgaden. Boxcars packed with paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, silver. Locals had already raided some cars, scattering treasures across Bavaria. The U.S. Army recovered thousands of pieces and staged a public exhibition. Repatriation efforts continued for years, returning works to museums, galleries, and families across occupied Europe. But some items were never found. Paintings taken from Jewish collectors, sculptures from Polish palaces, tapestries from French estates. The chaos of April and May 1945 created opportunities for theft that would take decades to unravel. Some pieces surfaced in private collections years later, others remained missing, presumably destroyed or hidden so well they'd become permanently lost. The mission to capture Göring succeeded through a combination of his own calculations and Allied speed. He'd gambled that his name recognition and political experience would make him valuable for negotiations. The Americans moved faster than he anticipated, retrieving him before the Soviets could reach his location. But they never saw him as a partner, only as a defendant. The 24 Americans who drove 52 miles behind uncertain lines achieved their objective. Stack, Shapiro, Foster, and the others brought in Hitler's designated successor without firing a shot. The mission represented one final manhunt in a war that had generated thousands. But Göring wasn't the last Nazi fugitive the Allies pursued through post-war chaos. Other names, other hunts, other desperate flights toward borders and hideouts would play out across Europe in the months and years ahead. Which Nazi leader do you think posed the greatest challenge to capture after the war ended? Drop your answer in the comments below. If you want to see how the hunt for the most notorious fugitives unfolded, the ones who almost escaped justice, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. I'll see you in the next one.